Let's finish up our discussion of carbohydrates, specifically structural polysaccharides. We'd introduced cellulose, but we hadn't really talked about how cellulose is different from starch, for example, even though they're both made out of glucose monomers. So let's take a look at glucose. Remember, glucose, if we look at its linear structure, looks like this up here. And whenever we add glucose to an aqueous solution, it forms ring structures. And it can form two different kinds of ring structures. On the left-hand side here, you see the alpha form of glucose. And on the right-hand side, you see the beta form of glucose. Really, the only difference between these two forms of glucose in the ring form is how those extra groups are attached to the very first carbon here. So if you imagine, again, pulling out now the alpha glucose form out of the screen and having the ring sort of parallel to the floor, in the alpha glucose form, the hydroxyl group attached to that first carbon is hanging out below the ring. On the other hand, if we take a look at the beta glucose form, and again we pull out that ring structure, that hydroxyl group attached to the first carbon is going to be on top of the ring. Only difference. So when we take a look at the comparison between starch and cellulose, starch is going to end up using the alpha glucose monomers, whereas cellulose uses the beta glucose monomers. What this does, essentially, in the starch molecule, to get the 1,4 glycosidic linkage for the glucose monomers attached to each other, when you put all of the alpha glucose monomers together, you end up with the hydroxyl group attached here to the second carbon, hanging out on the same side for all of the linked alpha glucose monomers. And this helps to create sort of that coiled shape to that starch molecule. On the other hand, for cellulose, in order to get that 1,4 glycosidic linkage instead now, what we have to end up doing is we flip the orientation of the glucose molecule. So you'll notice one is right side up and one is upside down. Right side up, upside down, which means that that second carbon with that hydroxyl group attached, sometimes the hydroxyl group will be pointing down and sometimes it'll be pointing up, down, up. It'll sort of alternate this way. What this means for those cellulose molecules is that the cellulose itself will exist in really long and straight chains of glucose molecules. Much like you see here, this is one really long cellulose molecule. On top of that, remember cellulose is part of that really tough plant cell wall. The reason why it has that toughness is because with the alternating hydroxyl groups on either side of the cellulose fibers, you can have hydrogen bonds that form between adjacent cellulose fibers. Remember, ... typically is going to mean hydrogen bonds. So you can see how when you line up all those cellulose fibers and then they hydrogen bond with each other, that creates a lot of structural support to the cellulose itself. And then if you take those cellulose microfibrils and you interweave them here into the structure of the plant cell wall, you can imagine how much rigidity and protection that cellulose can give to the plant cells themselves. Now, as you imagine eating a salad, for example, right? Eating plant material. When you eat that plant material, you're getting both starch made out of glucose and you're getting cellulose made out of glucose. Now, our bodies, in our digestive system, we only produce one type of enzyme that can digest the glycosidic linkages for those polysaccharides. In fact, the enzymes that digest starch by hydrolyzing the alpha linkages can't hydrolyze the beta linkages in cellulose. So that means if we as animals produce the enzyme that can degrade starch, we don't have the enzyme that can degrade the cellulose. So that means that we can get a whole bunch of energy or fuel or glucose from the starch molecules by cutting them all up. We can't do the same with cellulose. So we actually don't get any energy at all whatsoever from those cellulose molecules. That's not to say that cellulose is not important. And in fact, it's quite an important part of your diet as it passes through your digestive system as this insoluble fiber. helps keep you regular, and your digestive tract essentially happy and healthy. So it is still an important part of your diet. Now, just because we as animals can't digest the cellulose doesn't mean that nobody else can. In fact, there are certain microbes like bacteria that do have the enzymes to digest the cellulose. And in fact, there are some higher level organisms like cows and termites that consume a lot of plant-based material. They actually have a symbiotic relationship with some of these microbes that have the ability to digest the cellulose. And they house those microbes within their gut. So for example, when a cow eats a whole bunch of grass, it depends on those microbes in its gut to help digest all that cellulose into individual glucose monomers, and then the cow can absorb that and use those glucose molecules as fuel.